Hey, what's going on, guys? Today we're going to be checking out two very old California ghost towns, English Camp and Spanish Town. Now located in the Almaden Quicksilver County Park, both towns were founded in the mid-1800s when Mercury, or Quicksilver, was found in the area. While we're going to check out both town sites in detail, I first wanted to point out that there's tons of cool relics along the trails in this park. One of the trends that I noticed while walking around the area was an abundance of old vehicles that seem to have slipped down the hillside over the years. While we'll never really know how these ended up here, it's probably something such as the roadway giving way at some point, or maybe during the wet season the road was really slippery and a few of these cars just skidded off or something like that. Before we look at some of the buildings and remnants in depth, one thing that I wanted to point out is that the history of Spanish Town and English Camp goes back very far. For reference, the oldest topo map of the area had already labeled both settlements as abandoned by 1916. This really highlights the nature of early mining communities that disappeared nearly as quickly as they popped up. While marginal quicksilver mining persisted until about 1970, the bulk of the cinnabar ore was gone by the turn of the century, and so were the people. Now to focus in on English Camp. Quoting newalmaden.org. The site was originally a settlement established by Cornish miners in the 1860s. It was a town for the miners and their families, numbering about 1,000. The site included a schoolhouse, company store, mining office, Methodist church, community halls, and family cabins. English Camp actually has a good amount of structures still standing, but the thing is that most of them are not from the original settlement in the mid-1800s. A good amount of time after the original settlement was abandoned, the Civilian Conservation Corps actually moved in the 1930s and demolished pretty much most of the original structures. Some of the original structures were maintained and actually retrofitted to be used by the Civilian Conservation Corps, but it's difficult to say which of the remaining structures that you can see here are actually original versus being erected sometime in the 20th century. This barn and now collapsed garage that was pictured earlier are speculated to have been from the original settlement. However, it's much more likely that this was erected sometime in the 1900s to support later mining activity or the Civilian Conservation Corps when they were in the area. Here you can see what many assume to be a mining office from the original settlement. However, as you can see here, even if it is original, it was retrofitted in 1942, likely by the Army Corps of Engineers. Next, we're going to check out the remnants of another supposedly original structure. This vault and fireplace are supposedly part of another original mining office structure. While I'm not an archaeologist, the craftsmanship on this fireplace here does look period correct for the mid-1800s. Back to the center of town now. In the top right corner, I placed a picture to show what this area would have looked like in the mid-1800s. Up the hill from the flagpost in the center of town, you'll be able to find the remnants of the original schoolhouse of English Camp. As a matter of fact, I can say that these remains are some of the only ones that I can confirm are from the original settlement. Founded in 1864, the school educated the young of Mine Hill until 1907. Students in grades 1 through 8 spent 10 months of the year with a dedicated and sometimes strict teacher. After grade 8, children received technical training to prepare them for life ahead. The English Camp School was very important to New Almaden's mining communities for over 40 years. In 1886, 253 students attended the English Camp School. Students from Spanish Camp came here for grades 5 through 8. The school housed 4 teachers. One also acted as principal. Alright, next we're going to be moving on to the larger and older of the two settlements, Spanish Town. The little community of Spanish Town that used to exist in these hills is far older than most people would imagine. Prefacing Spanish Town, the history of the new Almaden cinnabar deposits actually starts back in 1824. This was the year that the cinnabar deposits were discovered by native California. However, at the time, the individual didn't realize that this was actually cinnabar, but just a vermilion-looking rock that seemed to be worth something. About 20 years later, in 1845, Andres Castillero, a captain in the Mexican military, experimented with the vermilion rock and concluded that it was actually cinnabar, which was a holder of Mercury, or Quicksilver. An interesting fact is that Castillero's first employees were actually Native Americans, whose wages, sadly, were little to nothing. However, in 1846, Castillero ended up selling the property as the Mexican-American conflict was starting to get underway. He sold the property to an English industrial firm, Forbes Company. With big money now injected into the area, Alexander Forbes brought with him skilled workers from Mexico and high-tech mining equipment. Still predating the California gold rush, this is the year that many would say that the community of Spanish Town was settled. 2 years after Spanish Town was technically settled, the California gold rush took off and the demand for Mercury went through the roof. Considering the rich history of this area, sadly very few relics or original structures remain today. The buildings here are near the original town site of Spanish Town, but were more than likely constructed in the early to mid-1900s to support later mining activity in the area. Very similar to the story of English Camp, pretty much all of the original structures of Spanish Town were removed by the Army in the early 1900s. With that being said though, a big reason why I'm making this video is that I want to point out some of the gems from the original settlement of Spanish Town. Heading back down the hill towards the Hidalgo Cemetery, you can see some plants that just don't quite fit in with the rest of the landscape. This gets a lot more interesting here on the left when you walk by this little crop of cactus. Many sources state this cactus here was actually planted by early settlers to Spanish Town in the 1800s. We're now approaching one of my favorite spots of the entire park, which is the Hidalgo Cemetery. The Hidalgo Cemetery isn't actually the original cemetery of Spanish Town, but was built in 1879 to replace the Guadalupe Cemetery, which was apparently a lot smaller and the original one of the area. Even though it's not the original cemetery for Spanish Town, it can be directly linked to the original settlement. And furthermore, you can see the original outline of the cemetery along with all of these cypress trees that were likely planted back when it was first carved out. You might be looking at this video and wondering where all the headstones are. The remains were actually removed and relocated to a cemetery in San Jose in the 1930s. In 1933, the Corps of Engineers contracted with Tommy Monahan, and a funeral director in San Jose, to remove the remains and rebury them at Oak Hill. Even though they believe they moved them all, the Quicksilver County Park Department continues to care for the cemetery as though there are still remains there. And so while it's not technically a cemetery anymore, it still has a lot of significance because those who buried their loved ones here back in the day really thought that this was going to be their final resting place. And the fact that this site contains many of its original features, such as these cypress trees, is just really interesting to me. I took some drone footage of the site because I couldn't find any online, and you can really see the time and effort that went into making this area as special as possible back in the day. I hope the park continues to preserve the cemetery, and those who visit continue to respect it as well. Most of the structures that still stand today are either from the Army Corps of Engineers building in the 1930s or from later mining activity that took place. This rotary furnace is a great example of mining equipment that was used up until the 1970s. It's fallen apart a bit over the last 50 years, but is largely in its original form still. Next is the hangman's tree, which apparently there was a hanging back in the 1800s. I personally don't find it that interesting, but took a video of it anyway. On the way to our final stop, the San Cristobal Tunnel, you can see a collapsed building here off in the trees to the left. The San Cristobal Tunnel is a mine portal that was used up until the 70s, and until a few years ago you could actually enter it. But recently they've put some chicken wire over the front with these boards so you can only peek from the outside. And even though you can't enter it, it's just awesome to be able to visit a mine portal minutes away from Silicon Valley. It's crazy. With historic sites in California being forgotten or bulldozed every day, it's cool to see original structures like this still standing. And not just standing, but actually maintained and preserved as well too. And that completes today's video. Thanks for watching.